The following podcast is brought to you by the Station of the Cross. Thank you for listening.
The contemplatives in the church are the prayers, the professional prayers.
I mean, I've watched congressional hearings, certainly judicial hearings for the Supreme Court. Most of it is very bad theater.
There is something in the human heart that hasn't been designed at Harvard but in heaven that can only be filled with the one who designed it.
I am by no means an economist.
You sound like one. You're better than any number of them, including some that have Nobel Prizes.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network and the iCatholic Radio app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Friends, I got a text this morning from a very dear old friend who was asking me to have more clarity and less charity here at the Catholic Current. We'll see whether or not we satisfy or disappoint him today by asking this provocative question: have we gone liturgically insane? Our expert guest is a Catholic theologian and philosopher, a composer of sacred music, a writer, blogger, editor, publisher, and public speaker. I have read all of his books on liturgy, and I've just reread the book we're going to use today as a point of departure, called Tradition and Sanity, Conversations and Dialogues of a Post-Conciliar Exile. Dr. Peter Korzeniewski, welcome to the Catholic Current.
Thank you very much, Father McTeigue.
Dr. Korzeniewski, you've traveled a very great deal. You study deeply. I'm having a hard time keeping up with all the things that you write and say about liturgy. So I want to have you be a diagnostician for a moment. When you survey the life of the Church in the United States, what would you say is the state of liturgical health in your typical American parish?
Unfortunately, I don't think that the patient in this case is doing very well. I think the patient, if we can call it such, is on life support, and the vital signs are weak. We saw in the recent, much discussed Pew research that faith in the real presence and in transubstantiation is extremely low, shockingly low among Catholics. And I think that basically what you see in most parishes, and this is confirmed not only by what I've seen, but just by tons of reports I get from people who write to me. I feel like I have a kind of a central station I hear from all sides, is a settled routine of mediocrity. I think that's what I would describe it as. Not necessarily the horrible sacrileges and experimentation that you got in the 1960s and 70s. That unfortunately
not the clown liturgies. That's not.
Yeah, exactly. And and the Jesuits. Sorry to pick on your order, but with beer and pizzas and all sorts of things. That kind of stuff I think has mostly long since passed.
Thank you, Jesus.
What you find now is just this settled routine of mediocrity where it's bland music, beige Catholicism, as Robert Barron calls it, and just not any real fervor or faith in the liturgy as a transcendent mystery and something, a place where we come into contact with the very reality of God, which should be an awesome, humbling, silencing experience for us, something that really deeply renews us and nourishes us. And I think that's not happening. Or if it is happening, it's happening maybe in an emotional way, in charismatic situations where people get excited about their faith. But I think that's very superficial, and it's kind of dangerous as well. So there are different problems, but I think mediocrity is the main problem right now.
Friends, we were talking with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, a theologian, scholar, composer, philosopher, and we're asking him about the state of liturgical health in the United States and the West in general. So Dr. Kwasniewski, if you walked into, we refer very often to St. Typicals or Our Lady Help of Suburbia, pastored by Monsignor Cheerful, and you looked around with an innocence, could you at the end say, clearly, I am observing the source and the summit of the spiritual lives of these people?
No, of course not. I mean, what you could say is that those who are still going, and it tends to skew towards middle age and old age, but those who are still going are finding in it some kind of satisfying communal ritual by which they feel comforted. Maybe they feel like they belong, which is a good thing, and there is comfort in religion.
Certainly,
but it's largely a horizontal atmosphere of a meeting in which various things are being said, and it's kind of generically pious. But it certainly does not seem to be coming to the foot of the cross with Our Lady and St. John and participating in the awesome sacrifice of Calvary for our redemption. That's not what you see. That's not what you feel.
Well, how about this? There's a lot of talk of the new evangelization, and if we understand it in John Paul's original sense, that, if you will, it's mission and outreach to the people who've wandered or drifted or left the church, to what degree is the liturgy as practiced at St. Typicals, to what degree is it well suited to affect the new evangelization? Right.
That is something I've thought about that a great deal, and I think, in fact, many of the changes that have been made to the liturgy and many of the practices we're dealing with were designed to attract more people, more modern people, to appeal to them at their level, where they're at, as people say. And the statistics certainly don't bear out that it's communicating very effectively. I think the problem is that if somebody has drifted from the Lord, the only thing that's likely to bring them back is something fairly dramatic that happens in their lives. I mean, it could be like a death in the family, or some kind of personal tragedy. Their life gets turned upside down, and they're searching for meaning. They're desperate to find meaning and order and sanity again. And when they come to a church, I mean, I think this is why people love adoration so much. If they come to a silent church, they can actually sit there and be in God's presence, and in a certain way let Him work on them, right? It's about God's action more than about coming and singing a bunch of ditties or something. It's not. And so I think a lot of people who are, let's say, non-religious, or they're quote-unquote spiritual and they're seeking religious affiliation, would be really turned off by St. Typicals, because the music is just so awful to begin with, right? Even if as a composer, that's the thing that speaks to me first. If the amateur guitars start playing and you have these sort of meandering, sappy melodies and talking about I am this and I am that and we are this and we're bread for our poor, and it's so off-putting. It has very little to do with worship of God.
My fear is that we've lost the vocabulary, the resources for dealing with real human life, with the treasures of God. A case in point, some years ago, I was assisting at a university, and there was a tragedy. A student had committed suicide, and we were going to have some sort of memorial mass. And right before we were about to start, someone from campus ministry ran up to the microphone and said to the people there, "Welcome to our celebration." A lot of things must have gone wrong before that gentleman went up to the microphone. What do you think some of those things might have been?
Oh, my goodness. Well, gosh, I don't even know where to begin with that, because that just seems like a sort of a basic lack in mental togetherness, being aware of your surroundings, aware of socially intelligent,
sense of occasion.
No, I think about the... you brought up a funeral mass or a ceremony for the dead, whatever exactly it was that was done. I think about the old Requiem Mass. It's, for me, one of the true gems. One of the crown jewels of the Roman Rite is the Requiem Mass.
Yes.
And if you've seen it, I know you've seen it, I'm sure you've celebrated it. Once you see it, especially in its solemn form, it's totally unforgettable. I mean, it can be like a life-changing, life-shattering experience, but not because it's doing anything to kind of reach out to you and connect with you. It almost ignores the congregation. All the prayers are directed to God, even more so than in the regular Mass, because there are all sorts of subtle details by which the Mass is intensely focused simply on praying for the soul of the dead.
Yes.
And in a sense, it ignores the people, or it calls upon them also to concentrate completely on praying for the dead. So it has a somberness to it with the black vestments and with the dies irae and so on that makes people, I think, sort of come home to the reality of their mortality, their creatureliness, their dependence on God, their dependence on one another. Ironically, I think there's a communal dimension there that is cultivated precisely by the lack of attention to the communal dimension.
Right.
And so we have this experience of, we can really deeply mourn, we can feel the weight of the tragedy of the human condition and of sin and error. And so in a way, it's a liturgy that perfectly captures our situation and unleashes from us what we need to do at that moment, And
if I wanted to send a thank you note to the committee that designed that liturgy, where would I send it?
That's a great question. Yeah, you couldn't possibly do it because it took about 1,000 years to develop in that way.
Right. That was a deliberate question. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski about liturgy and the state of the church today. In the next segment, we're going to ask him whatever happened to the reform of the reform. And we want to hear from you. Get on the line now. Call us 1-877-511-5483. Text us the same number, 1-877-511-5483. What's your experience at your parish been? We want to know. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. We've started another very important conversation here at the Catholic Current. We need you to spread it among your family and friends. We want it to spread around the world. It's something we can do together. We cannot do it without you. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
Tune in weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern for Sermons for Everyday Living, a program that brings you real sermons from real priests on topics important to you and your faith. Visit thestationofthecross.com for details. Users of iCatholic Radio are raving about our app in the iTunes and Google Play stores. One user says, "It's exactly what I was looking for since having a closer walk with my Lord and my God. Great app for the living Catholic. Praise God." Nancy says, "This is the best app. I have become a regular listener to it. I use it every day. I also play it all night long while we sleep. Get this app and use it. It will change your life for the better." Another user recommends iCatholic Radio, saying, "So sweet a sound. This has allowed me to listen to Catholic radio when I travel. What an awesome learning tool. Thank you." If you haven't reviewed iCatholic Radio yet, what are you waiting for? Visit your iTunes or Google Play store today.
Whether you're driving the kids to school or making a stop at the grocery store, you can share the Catholic faith with others by displaying a Catholic Radio bumper magnet on your car. Order your free bumper magnets at thestationofthecross.com. Just click on the Promote tab at the top of our website. We'd be happy to send bumper magnets for your listening area so that others can come to know the Lord. That's thestationofthecross.com and click on the Promote tab. Thank you for sharing Catholic Radio on the road.
You're listening to the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network, Call in to the Catholic Current this hour at 1-877-511-5483. Each morning, the Catholic Current sends out a short survey on the topic for today's show so that you can share your thoughts and any questions you might have. This is a great way to participate, especially if you aren't able to call in live. A few of the responses will be read over the air to add to the discussion, so make sure you sign up to receive our emailed survey at thestationofthecross.com.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network and the iCatholic Radio app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about liturgical sanity and insanity with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. We're speaking about his book, Tradition and Sanity. I also highly recommend his other books on liturgy, Resurgent in the Midst of Crisis, as well as Noble Beauty, Transcendent Holiness. You can find that in the notes after the show. Dr. Kwasniewski, one of the themes, phrases we had heard for many years, and now apparently it's been on the index of forbidden thoughts or phrases, was called the reform of the reform. And the narrative went something like this, that right around 1963, perhaps as early as 1958, somebody realized that the Roman Rite was significantly broken in liturgy, and we were going to have the barnacles removed, and it would be restored to us in our pristine reform. And then either things got out of hand, or bad men came and hijacked the reform of the liturgy and took it to places it should not go. But now with the reform of the reform, we can finally have access to what the Council had always and only and wisely intended. Let's start there. What do you make of that narrative?
Well, you brilliantly summarized the position of Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, who was the most famous proponent and the most influential of the reform of the reform. Yes, where to begin? So many questions. It seems to me that the reform of the reform, first of all, is a laudable intention, and it's well motivated. It's necessary for Catholics, for their spiritual health, to be connected with the whole liturgical tradition of the Church, which includes, for example, at least 1,500 years worth of development of Gregorian chant, the music form of the Roman Rite. It includes contact with Latin, even if Latin wouldn't be the exclusive language used, because that, again, is the language in which the Church worshipped for 1,500 years. Mm-hmm. And that's important, that that we do what all these generations of popes and saints and so on did before us. And it's very important that we celebrate eastwards, ad orientem. There are just so many different ways in which Catholic worship was unanimous and really theocentric, focused on God, focused on Christ. Yes. Before the Council, and afterwards we've just drifted from that. So one can understand the desire to bring back these elements. The problem, there are multiple problems with the reform of the reform. The first and most basic problem is that it depends on a narrative, which you summarized. It depends on a narrative in which the popes all along have wanted a more traditional-looking liturgy, one that's in continuity with the past, and that it got derailed by various local fruitcakes and bad initiatives, bishops' conferences, whatever. So it got derailed. What Vatican II gave us, what Pope Paul VI gave us, that's just not true, and it can be very shocking for Catholics when they start to research this to realize that it was none other than Paul VI who drove forward a very radical reform that was, spearheaded by Annibale Bugnini, but of course Paul VI was the one who gave it all the muscle, all the papal administrative muscle, and he wanted multiple Eucharistic prayers. He wanted celebration versus populum, towards the people. He did it himself very publicly in 1965, years before the Novus Ordo came out. He wanted the vernacularization of the liturgy, and he wanted popular religious singing. He even said in 1969, in a couple of addresses that I've analyzed online, he said, we have to kiss goodbye. We have to wave goodbye to the immeasurable and priceless heritage of Gregorian chant and Latin, because if we don't do this, then basically modern man is going to be cut off from the liturgy. So Paul VI is the biggest foe of the reform, and that's kind of hardwired or baked into all of the liturgical books and all of the rubrics and all the expectations for them. So it's already swimming very much upstream just to try to reverse that papally authorized process. The other problem is it's also swimming upstream at the local level, at the decades of habits that have been formed in the faithful. So the faithful are expecting, when they come to Mass, those who still go to Mass, they're expecting the vernacular, they're expecting a certain kind of music, generally. They're expecting a kind of celebratory style that's very personable and a little bit informal. They're not expecting, to come in and hear an introit chanted in Gregorian chant, or to have to use a worship aid that translates the Latin for them or something. And they're especially not expecting the priest to, quote-unquote, turn his back towards them. So when the reform options are pursued, what ends up happening is lots of people's feathers are ruffled, many upset letters are written to the bishop, and pretty soon the whole experiment just blows up. It's easier to introduce the old Mass into a parish than it is to do the reform for the simple reason that the old Mass is a package deal. It's all or nothing. You got to do it a certain way. And when people see it, it holds together. It kind of has its own internal, slowly matured unity to it, and you kind of respect it as a work of art. It just is the way it is. But with the Novus Ordo, it has so many changing pieces that you can do it this way, that way, or the other way, and that's why people get very upset when priests start to experiment with traditional options.
Well, I was once accused of being a younger member of the Latin Taliban, because clearly Vatican II had forbidden things like the Sanctus and Agnus Dei in Latin. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Tim McDonald, said, "Father, if you remember the Latin Taliban, Amis Sama bin ablative." Dr. Korzeniowski, we have a... Yes, I wish I had said that. We have a caller on the line now, Doctor. We have Ralph from Boston, Massachusetts. Ralph, welcome to the Catholic Current. What's your question?
It's not a question, Father. It's an observation.
Okay.
I'm 77 years old. I'm a cradle Catholic who was out of the church for 7 years. When I came back into the church, it was the Novus Ordo that drove me out. When I came back in, I was I thought I could go either way. And then several years ago, I began working as an acolyte under the Tridentine form. And I came to fully understand the rubrics, and I think the answer is to go back to the Tridentine form. If you want to say it in English, fine. Especially the prayers of the offertory and the prayers of consecration.
Well, thank you for your observation, Dr. Korzeniowski. Do you have a reply to Ralph?
Yes, I would just say that first of all, that I know many people, I've talked to many people over the years, older people who were driven out of the church, essentially. They kind of pulled out their hair and went crazy with all the changes that were coming fast and furious. So I personally admire people who have kind of stuck with it and come back to the church, even though they were, I would say, psychologically abused by what was done in the 1960s and 1970s. But yes, I think that the way forward is the Tridentine Mass. As unlikely as that sounds, it actually has a kind of indestructible power to it that the Novus Ordo doesn't have. And it could, I think we could be very surprised at what the situation looks like in 50 years.
Doctor, let me ask you this. Suppose somebody says, "Gosh, I understand where you guys are coming from, but here's two key words that for a lot of people are insuperable hurdles: participation and understanding." So whatever else has happened in the past 50 years, for better or worse, there are these two indispensable goods that cannot be had in the venerable rites. I've heard that said, and I'm sure you've heard that too. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I would say I understand the desire that people have to enter into the liturgy and not to see it as what critics might call a dumb show, something that someone else is doing far away. and you're just sort of along for the ride, and you know, maybe get bored, and you have to occupy yourself with something else. You know, that seems fully legitimate for people who want to participate and be a part of it in some kind of intimate way. But this is what I've seen, and I think this is very important, although it's hard to persuade people of it until they have the experience, because it's on an experiential level.
Right.
What I think is that the fundamental requirement for authentic worship is not at the level of the intellect. It's not at the level of verbal comprehension. It's at the level of a certain attitude of soul or spirit before God. And what the liturgy has to do first, or has to enable us to do, is to enter humbly and reverently and adoringly into God's holy presence. That's what it has to help us do first. And in that sense, it has to create a certain atmosphere. I don't want to sound, you know, cinematographic here, but it needs to create a certain atmosphere of prayer, of solemnity, of discipline, even, I would say, such that we can, in a sense, put off our secular and profane mentality and really try to come into contact with our Maker and our Redeemer. Yes. And the old Mass does that with incomparable skill and power. It creates that sacred atmosphere.
The old rite has a lot of practice. It's been doing it a while.
And I think, frankly, that a lot of modern people initially are scared by that, because my experience growing up was I went to Mass for years and years and years and years, and I never ever felt a sense of holy fear at any of those Masses. I never felt going up to communion like, I better be careful what I'm doing because this is fire. I'm playing with fire. You know, I never thought that way. I never thought, this is like, this is my opportunity to be transported into the court of heaven, and I had better be totally prepared for that. I just didn't think that way, because it just didn't seem at all like a very serious thing was going on. So I really think that the key to participation is to be in the right mind, the right attitude, the right spirit. And then the next question is, well, what about understanding? Because the liturgy is obviously verbal. It's made up of lots of prayers, words, readings, antiphons. And there, I think the liturgical movement was just on the right track from the 19th century to roughly Vatican II, namely, give people, well, first of all, Catholics should learn some Latin. They should learn some of their own prayers. It's not that difficult. The State of Israel reintroduced the Hebrew language from scratch. I mean, this can be done. If there's a will, there's a way. Yes. But beyond that, there are hand missals. There are tons of hand missals. They still exist. They're all being reprinted now because, supply meets demand. Right. Where you can open up to, the 12th Sunday after Pentecost, and there you are. There's the introit, there's the collect, there's the epistle, there's the gospel. It's all there.
Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, author of the book Tradition and Sanity. And in the next segment, we're going to ask him, why is reverence not enough? I think you do not want to miss that. And remember, today is Wednesday. That means my weekly column at aleteia.org is available, aleteia.org. You don't want to miss that. After the broadcast, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Friends, this is one of the most important conversations we can have. It touches upon the first commandment. It's about worshiping God as He has taught us to worship Him. We need to have this conversation spread around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
The Liturgy of the Hours is prayed 3 times a day on the Station of the Cross at 5 a.m., 3 p.m., and 9:30 p.m. Eastern. The Liturgy of the Hours is a meditative and efficacious way to foster habitual prayer. It is the daily prayer of the Church, prayed throughout the world by priests, religious, and laity. For details about each hour or more information about the Liturgy of the Hours, visit thestationofthecross.com.
Prayer of Deliverance. Almighty God and Father, we beg Thee, through the intercession and help of the archangels Saint Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel, for the deliverance of our brothers and sisters who are enslaved by the evil one, from anxiety, sadness, and obsessions.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
From hatred, fornication, and envy.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
From thoughts of jealousy, rage, and death.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
from every thought of suicide and abortion.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
From every form of sinful sexuality.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
From every division in our family and every harmful friendship.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
From every sort of spell, malefice, witchcraft, and every form of the occult.
We implore Thee, deliver us, O Lord.
Thou who said, Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, grant that through the intercession of the Virgin Mary, we may be liberated from every demonic influence and enjoy Thy peace always. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
At iCatholic Radio, we're blessed to bring you the good news of Jesus Christ through the latest of technology. But don't rely on just one of your mobile devices for listening to iCatholic Radio. Download our free app to all of your Android and Apple mobile devices, ensuring you never miss a show. That's iCatholic Radio. Great Catholic programming available for download through the Google Play and iTunes stores.
You're listening to the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network. Call in to the Catholic Current this hour at 1-877-511-5483. If you miss any portion of today's show or want to listen to any past episodes, click the podcast link under the Programs tab at the top of our homepage, thestationofthecross.com.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network and the iCatholic Radio app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about liturgical sanity and insanity with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, author of the book Tradition and Sanity, Conversations and Dialogues of a Post-Conciliar Exile. In this segment, we're going to talk about why is reverence not enough? Dr. Kwasniewski, I'm sure you've heard something along the followings. Gosh, you guys you're right about a lot of things, but isn't it the case that the new rite, the Novus Ordo Mass, really can be offered reverently? And we have two takes on that. One is I've heard Dr. Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon talk about the Novus Ordo Unicorn Mass. There is a Mass out there which no one has ever seen, and no one can deny that it exists, and it's done reverently and ad orientem on a high altar with noble vessels and all the Latin you could ever want, etc., etc. And it's possible, it's just that no one has ever seen it. I've offered it myself, so I know it's not just a unicorn. On the other hand, you have a quote from Martin Mosebach where he says, "It is possible to celebrate the new Mass reverently and beautiful, but that is precisely the problem," end quote. In other words, it's merely possible that you can do it that way. But you've written and say, even if it were done reverently with all the smells and bells and whistles you could want, that's not enough. What's lacking is tradition. Why do you hold that? Tell us more, please.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly what Martin Mosebach says is pertinent, that the liturgy ought to be something that has a kind of confidence born of the ages, born of centuries of prayer, that this is what we need, this is what the faithful need to come into contact with. So it shouldn't just be a kind of set of modules that the celebrant gets to put together and assemble, according to his own whims or lights. But the deeper question here is, what does the liturgy itself contain? What is it giving us? Mm-hmm. It's even if one chooses all of the most traditional options in the Novus Ordo, one is still dealing with a fundamentally new missal. The Missal of Paul VI is a new book. It's not a revision of an old book. And I remember for me, there are certain moments in my life that have been a little bit like, the grenade is thrown into the foxhole for me, and I've had to rethink my whole position. But one of those grenades for me was when I started doing more detailed research about just how much discontinuity there is between the Old and the New Missals. Just to give one particularly startling statistic, the New Missal, the orations of the New Missal, that is the what we call the collect and the secret or prayer of the gifts and the post-communion prayer, only 17% of those old orations made it intact into the New Missal. without either being deleted or severely modified. So that's a 17% overlap. I mean, so the point is that the new missal actually reflects a new theology, a new approach to theology. For example, it seriously downplays penance and asceticism and contemptus mundi, contempt for the world, as you'd find it in a classic like The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. You know, that kind of spirit of asceticism and self-denial and humility and mortification is very, very prominent in the old liturgy, and it's almost completely gone in the new liturgy. And that's just a fact. That's not just I'm not making this up.
Right.
And there are other such examples. Another example would be that the explicit acknowledgments of the Trinity, what we would call doxologies, explicit worship of the Trinity is much more prominent in the old rite. It's been almost removed from the new rite. And similarly, acknowledgments of the divinity of Christ have been muted as well. So what you're actually looking at in technical terms is a different lex credendi, a different content of faith, something different that we're being asked to believe and we're being formed in, even if we don't realize it. And that, to me, is profoundly troubling and troublesome.
Well, yes.
Because, but then I could just add...
Go ahead, please.
Well, let me just add one more thought, which is that the old missal also contains very, very important sections that are missing. So it contains the prayers at the foot of the altar. It contains the offertory prayers, the last gospel, and many others. There are quite a few if you put them side by side, the old and the new orders of Mass. And the things that have been removed are some of the most profound and beautiful prayers of our tradition, some of them very, very old, and very much a part of the way that we've always prayed. And you have to ask yourself, what is the cumulative effect on the clergy of not praying with those prayers, or not using the genuflections, or not using some of the rubrics, the bows and various
I'm glad that you asked that, because oftentimes conversations about liturgy devolve into what's your favorite flavor ice cream or your favorite brand of pizza, and those questions are not resolvable and they're not interesting. But if we also ask the question, what is best for the priest? What helps Father to pray? Because I very, very rarely hear that question. On your view, you've studied the liturgy. I'm sure some of your best friends are priests. They're certainly mine. What do you think, if you were going to help Father grow in holiness and grow in his identity of priesthood, what would you wish for him in the liturgy?
Well, above all, that the priest see himself as deeply identified with Christ as the high priest and the victim. One of my favorite books for spiritual reading is a book called Insinu Jesu, and it talks about this a great deal, that the priest is called to be not just another Christ, but a high priest and sacrificial victim. And so the priest needs to be conformed by the liturgy to what he is doing. And the old liturgy does that with incomparable pedagogical success. It's always having the priest kissing the altar and genuflecting and bowing and all these sorts of this body language that roots what we believe in our muscles and in our bones, right? It's not just a conceptual thing. And the Novus Ordo, unfortunately, is terribly verbose and conceptual. It's all at the level of, it's all at one level of rationality. It's very thin in that sense. Like C.S. Lewis talks about the difference between thin religion and thick religion.
Right.
And the new Mass is a thin religion, and the old one is a thick one. And that's, of course, going to have an effect on whether a priest continues to believe in what he's doing and in what he is. Fulton Sheen says the reason why Judas betrayed Christ is that he ceased to believe in him as the Messiah, and in particular he did not find him in the Eucharist, and that's why he abandoned Christ.
Yes.
Well, this is what we see in the Church.
Right. Well, I'm interjecting, and we're talking with Dr. Peter Korzeniewski about liturgical sanity. In this segment, we're talking about why reverence is not enough, and tradition is needed. It seemed to me in the 60s and 70s, looking back on my youth, there was a loss of confidence in symbols. In addition to the lay reader, the lay lector, there was a commentator who would speak words, so if there was a gesture, someone could tell you what it meant. John and Sally Smith are bringing the wine and gifts up work now. This means that they're giving gifts. But what if you go to the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, which is done in absolute silence, even if you walked in from Mars, you'd have the sense that something tremendously important was taking place, and no one's going to say, "Hi, everybody, I'm Lieutenant Jim. How you all doing today?" It doesn't happen that way. Let me mention another word that has become an alarmist word, the word restoration. I mean, if you want to crush the career or vocation of a seminarian, and most seminaries I've heard, people have told me this directly, you have to say, Mr. Smith, he's got a restorationist view of liturgy. And then people avert their eyes. Why is the word restoration such a dirty word in some circles?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a dirty word for the simple reason that modern Catholic theology and sadly many members of the hierarchy are completely have completely fallen prey to a Hegelian idea of dialectic. What I mean by that is where the modern world is sort of bringing about inexorable progress and change, and there's no way we can reverse it. There's no way we can quote unquote go back. There's nothing that was done in the past that is wiser or more beautiful or more sane than what we're doing now. And the church has to get with the times and be changing herself. And the problem with that, of course, is that it's not true. But all the great reform movements in the history of the church go back to some model, some shining example that they want to imitate again and restore. So all reform is essentially restorationist. But it's also false because once you start chasing after change, where do you stop? You just become caught up in a perpetual whirlwind of change. Of course, the liturgists themselves, the modern liturgists, whom most people don't bother to read, they're not really worth reading, but they're very impatient about what they see as quote-unquote stagnation in the Roman Rite. They want it to be perpetually changing. The ones who've really kind of drunk the Kool-Aid, they want to see it constantly changing. And you see this a little bit with the Amazon Synod. Anyway, I don't want to get into too many other issues.
No. Well, we'll just have to have you on again very soon. Well, how about this? We recognize that there is a human need for continuity. There's also a Catholic obligation to be a faithful steward of what Christ and his saints have entrusted to us in the church. And I think we can make a strong case that, at least in the past 50 years, we haven't been great stewards of the treasures that have been entrusted to us. What are the consequences of the stewardship that we've been living with the past 50 years?
Well, I mean, the most tragic result of all is that it seems to me that the vast majority of Catholics, I think this is changing somewhat because of the internet, but the vast majority of Catholics seem to be unaware of the past of the church, of the tradition, of the history. It's as if, well, as Ratzinger often, in a way, satirized, it's as if the church began with Vatican II. It just began yesterday, and we sort of cobbled this all together ourselves, and we're following this, this neat itinerant street preacher from Nazareth, and we're into social justice, and and we're talking about climate and the poor all the time, and it's really it's like something that could have been constructed by the United Nations,
Right.
And they don't realize that we're talking about, I like to say, not just 20 centuries of faith and culture and intellect and beauty, as you see in the European cathedrals, but also, another 1,000 years of the Jewish, the Hebrew preparation. So our tradition is 3,000 years old of worship. That to me is the greatest sort of tragedy, is the loss of that sense of our identity as having this enormous, vast richness and depth to it.
Right. I think there is a collective amnesia that's taken place. I remember when I was a young priest and we're setting up for a retreat, and we were getting ready for Eucharistic adoration, and the students asked me and this other young Jesuit if this was something that we had made up ourselves. And I said, look at the monstrance. I didn't make that out of toothpicks and popsicle sticks. Where do you think that came from? They had simply never heard of such a thing, and that's what I find tragic is that the treasures are not being handed on. Yeah. And I think we need to do better.
I agree, and there's such a hunger in the human heart for for identity and direction and meaning and belonging, and those are all legitimate things. They just don't get satisfied in proper ways in modern society or in the contemporary church.
And the losses that the modern world inflicts on us, there are other ways of dealing with it aside from tinkering with the liturgy. I want to give a shout out to Marianne from Syracuse, New York. She was waiting so patiently. I'm sorry we weren't able to get your call. We hope we can call again soon, Marianne. In the next segment, we're going to continue our conversation on liturgy with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, and we're going to ask, what should we do now? And we want you to be part of that conversation as well. After the broadcast, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. We're available on most major platforms, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Remember our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current, Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. Let's do it together. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is Father Jacek Mazer. Please join me in a prayer to Saint Jerome. Through your anger and confrontations, Saint Jerome, you remind us that we all have a duty to confront others from time to time. You also remind us that we have a duty to examine ourselves and confront our own weaknesses and harmful behaviors. If I see that I have the duty to confront another, I ask you to be with me during those moments of confrontation. Help me to remember that love alone can make changes for the good. Amen.
This is Franciscan Media's Saint of the Day for September 4th. Today we celebrate Saint Rose of Viterbo. Born in Viterbo, Italy, in 1233, Rose was devoted to prayer, penance, and service to the poor throughout her 18 years of life. At age 10, she became a secular Franciscan, preaching in the streets about sin and the sufferings of Jesus. She also encouraged support of the Pope, who at that time was engaged in a serious dispute with the emperor. In response, civic officials exiled Rose and her family from the city, even threatening the young girl's life. Only when the Pope's side was victorious were Rose and her family permitted to return to their home. At age 15, she attempted to found a religious community, but her dreams were not realized. Returning to a life of prayer and penance in her father's home, Rose died in 1251. She was canonized in 1457. Though she did not accomplish anything very extraordinary, Rose was able to achieve sainthood during her short time on earth. She made a place in her life for God's grace, and like St. Francis before her, she saw death as the gateway to new life. There's more about the saints along with inspiration and Catholic resources at our website, saintoftheday.org. From Franciscan Media, this has been Saint of the Day.
You're listening to the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network. Call in to the Catholic Current this hour at 1-877-511-5483. Shortly after the show, visit our page for the Catholic Current at thestationofthecross.com. You'll find a link to today's episode page where you can view Father McTeige's show resources and today's podcast.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network and the iCatholic Radio app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about liturgical sanity and insanity with Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. His latest book on liturgy is called Tradition and Sanity, Conversations and Dialogues of a Post-Conciliar Exile. In this segment, we're going to talk about what we should do now. Dr. Kwasniewski, I imagine you know the little quip from Mark Twain about the weather. He says, everyone has an opinion about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. You know, for those of us who are listening, you know, I'm in one part of the church and you all are in the pews. Where do we start? Suppose you've got Father Jones, he's been ordained 5 years, suddenly finds himself pastoral administrator of 2 parishes. And it's St. Typical's on one end of the street and Our Lady Help of Suburbia on the other. What advice do you give to poor Father Jones?
Oh, this is a very difficult question, just because I know that there's a lot of personal anguish in these questions and a lot of difficulty and second guessing that can go on. But basically, I think there have to be multiple strategies. There's not just going to be one secret weapon that fixes everything or destroys everything that needs to be destroyed. Maybe there's what needs to happen first of all is that the clergy, as much as they possibly can, need to gently and slowly reintroduce traditional elements wherever they're at. They need to preach Orthodox doctrine, of course, but they also need to show people by their bearing in the liturgy, by their modesty, by their, modesty in the sense of facial expressions and voice and eyes and so on. They need to show that they really believe what they're doing, that they really believe that the Lord is present. If they can, encourage people to receive communion kneeling and on the tongue. If they can encourage the choir to start using chant. I mean, these are gentle improvements. Of course, they run into the difficulties that we talked about earlier with the reform of the reform. So I'm not Pollyannaistic. I don't think that this is an easy approach, but it has to be done. It has to be tried. And some places it has borne a lot of fruit. So I've seen the reform of the reform work in certain communities. It's just a bit of a hit or miss thing. But parallel to that, it's very important for clergy to learn the so-called extraordinary form of the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. It's a deep enrichment for their own life. I don't need to tell you that. It's something that can be done at least on a priest's day off as his private Mass in his room, if nowhere else. And, it's the kind of thing that could be introduced as a first Saturday or a first Friday Mass, or at a time when maybe there wasn't a Mass or something like that. I think on the side of the laity, it's extremely important now more than ever for them to organize and to talk to priests, especially younger clergy who are much more open to these things, and just to present them in a calm and respectful way. This group of parishioners, 20 of us, 50 of us, however many they can get, are really, really interested in having a traditional Mass here. Would you please consider, doing it for us and learn it for us, And of course, the priest is supposed to respond affirmatively to that.
That's what the documents say. Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Yes. Doctor, we have a caller on the line now. We have Mr. Padawan from Southern California. Welcome back to the Catholic Current. What's your question?
Hello, Father. Hello, Doctor. Yeah, so I'm calling in because I've been listening to your program, and and so my question is, has the reforms, quote unquote, of Vatican II, have they allowed or introduced a form of Gnosticism into our liturgy? So, for example, I was just visiting Philadelphia, and I was visiting one actually used to be one of my favorite parishes. I don't think I'll ever go again, but and the priest during the Eucharistic prayer was referring to God our Mother, and even when he was holding on to the Eucharist, the source and summit of our lives, he didn't really have a whole lot of care for it. So I'm just wondering, is this something that Vatican II was introduced, or where did that come from?
Well, gosh, Dr. Krasniewski, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yes. I mean, I think, sir, that I think that the problem you're describing is really most of all due to a complete breakdown of authority and of clear instructions and of the enforcement of those legitimate instructions. I mean, there's certainly the council and nowhere in any of the official liturgical documents was a priest ever told that he should say or even could say anything about God or Mother or something like that. So that's just simply an abuse, a rank abuse. And similarly, treating the host carelessly, those are just bad habits and errors, and the Church ought to be doing something about them. But frankly, there's been this what Cardinal Burke calls antinomian spirit. This lawlessness, this lack of law and order, so to speak, that has really pervaded the whole Catholic world. And I think that's what you're seeing there. Right.
And I think there was a phrase too, wasn't it, from one of Ratzinger's work, who referred to liturgy to become casual, chatty, happy, and amused. Was that a Ratzinger phrase?
It sounds like something he might have said. I don't remember precisely.
Right. Okay. Right. But I think something has gone terribly wrong when we have a sense of, the liturgy is something we get to play with and fix according to our lights. When I was a new priest, I was invited to offer Mass for a Catholic student, do-good service. And I showed up for Mass, and this young lady approached me with a piece of paper in her hand and said, "Father, I've written the opening prayer for Mass. When do I say it?" And I said, "Never."
Hi, buddy.
And she said, "Oh, but Father so-and-so at Self-Identified Catholic University said that, the ladies meant to take ownership of the liturgy." And I said, "Oh, but that's simply not true. It's not a favorite home recipe that we can tinker with, is it?"
Exactly.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And this is also why I would say, we the theme of this segment is, what should we be doing? What can we do positively? And one thing that I say to everyone is, you might love your local parish. It might have been the parish of your grandparents or your great-grandparents. They might have helped to build it. You might have all kinds of friends there and so on. Maybe you don't feel that you can or should leave your parish, but do yourself a favor and go once in a while to a solemn high mass somewhere or a requiem mass or something, and really and get to know the fullness of your own Catholic tradition, your own Catholic faith. It's going to elevate you. It's going to inspire you. It could anger you in a sense, and I think that could be a good thing. That is to be aware that as people like to say, God made us for more. Well, He did make us for more. He made us for the more that is our tradition. It's hard. And also most of all for the all that He is. But He also gave us this, this sort of like this vast, inexhaustible treasure chamber. And what are we doing with it? We're ignoring it to a large extent. So I think it's very important for people's spiritual lives to get to be familiar with the old liturgy, even if they can't go to it all the time. They should go to it sometimes. And it may be that the Lord is calling them to transfer, to go to it full time. And I know so many families that have felt just immensely blessed by making that kind of step.
Well, it takes discernment and it takes courage, and we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we owe God, and how does God want to bless us as Catholics? And I want to say sorry to Joe of Boston, Massachusetts, for leaving you hanging on the line. I hope you can call again. Dr. Peter Kozhnevsky, author of the book Tradition and Sanity, thank you for being a wonderful guest. We hope we can have you on there again soon.
Thank you very much, Father.
I'm Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your host Monday through Friday, 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern, here at the Catholic Current, the stationofthecross.com, and the iCatholic Radio app. You'll want to join us tomorrow when we welcome back Dr. Leonard Sachs and ask him about the Vatican's recent document on gender theory. You don't want to miss that. After the broadcast, go to the stationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything that you need to keep the conversation going around the world, we offer to you. May Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Station of the Cross. The Station of the Cross is a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please consider making a donation. Donations can be made through our website, thestationofthecross.com, or by calling 1-877-888-6279. You can also donate right through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app. Thank you for listening to and supporting the Station of the Cross, proclaiming the fullness of truth with clarity and charity.